Okay, so just to quickly recap, when you have a fraction as follows, when I have fractions here, the denominators are not the same. In this case, 1/3 where the denominator is a 3, and 2/6 where the denominator is a 6. Since 3 and 6 are not the same, I have to find the lowest common denominator. The lowest common denominator is the first number that I find that is divisible by both 3 and 6, that in this case exists on both sets of the multiplication table. So for the 3 denominator, I just simply wrote out the multiplication table for 3. Or a couple of entries, as you see here, 3 times 1, 3 times 2, 3 times 3. I did the same thing for the 6. And what I did is I looked to see where is the first instance that I see an answer that exists both in the multiplication table for 3 and for 6. And in this case, it happens to be the number 6. Because 6 times 1 is 6. And I also have that number 6 also on the left as 3 times 2 is 6. So my lowest common denominator is 6. So how do I actually go in and rewrite this fraction so that I can leverage and use that lowest common denominator? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite this fraction. Now typically, for those of you that remember this from high school or the last time you took a math class, I can simply go in and rewrite this number as 1/3 plus 2/6. So I'm just going to write it from top to bottom, okay? What I'm going to do is I'm going to put in the new lowest common denominator on the right, and I'm going to rewrite this fractions, or these two fractions, using my lowest common denominator as 6. So I'm going to put the 6 on the bottom in my two fractions. Now the first thing I have to do is to determine what's going to go in my field here. What's going to go in my numerator? Because the problem becomes, well, how do I determine that number? I know what the lowest common denominator is. That goes in my denominator, but what goes in my numerator? So here's the trick. The trick is to see what number is divisible by 6. Let me be more specific. When I look at these numbers here, I need to take my two denominators, and the first thing I'm going to do here, by the way, folks, I'm just going to focus on this section right here, on this first fraction. So I'm going to ask myself, 3 when it comes to 3 and 6, what number is divisible by 6? So 3 times what number, if I rewrite this very quickly, 3 times what number is going to give me 6? Well, that answer is 2. I know 3 times 2 is 6. So I'm going to take that number and put it up here. I'm going to multiply it times the number on top. Again, one more time. When I look at the bottom, my two denominators, I'm going to say 3 times what number would give me 6? Well, I know that 3 times 2 would give me 6. So I'm going to take that 2, put it on top right here. I'm going to multiply it times the number that I have in my numerator. So 2 times 1 is 2. Okay, I'm going to apply the same principle. 6 times what number here is going to give me 6? Well, I know that's going to be 6 times 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply 1 times the number on my numerator, which is 1 times 2, which becomes 2. So now I've just changed this problem so that instead it becomes 2, 6 plus 2, 6. And again, I can just simply bring over the 6, rewrite this as 2 plus 2, which gives me the value of 4 over 6, which would be correct. But if I wanted to reduce this down to its lowest possible term, I know that both 4 and 6 are even numbers, so I can divide them both by 2. So if I divide both sides by 2, 2 divided by 4 is 2. And 2 divided by 6 is 3, so my answer here is going to be 2/3. Okay, so let's try another example. Let's say for our next example, I had 3/4 plus 4/5. And again, the problem here is that my denominators are not the same, so I'm going to need to find the lowest common denominator, or the LCD, lowest common denominator. Now, the easiest way that I could do this, folks, is to come up with the multiplication tables for both 4 and 5. So if I write these out very quickly, I know that 4 times 1 is, well, that's not right. 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times 2 is 8. 4 times 3 is 12. Sorry, my typing and my talking are not in sync with each other here. 4 times 4 is 16. And I'm going to do 4 times 5 is 20. And the next one's going to be 4 times 6 is 24. I'm also now going to go in and I'm going to write the multiplication table for 5. So in this case, I'm just going to simply put in 5 times 1 is 5. 5 times 2 is 10. 5 times 2, correction, 5 times 3 is 15. 5 times 4 is 20. And 5 times 5 is 5. And let me just start with these just to see if there's any common denominators. Well, good news. There is, if I look through this list fairly quickly, what I find now, oops, sorry about that. What I find is that now I actually have 2 numbers that exist on both sides. 4 times 5 happens to be 20. And 5 times 4 happens to be 20. So 20 is the first number where I have both numbers, in this case, on both sides of my multiplication table, aka this is the lowest common denominator, the lowest common denominator that exists both in the 4 table and in the 5 table, which is the number 20. So I'm going to have to rewrite this problem as follows. I'm going to go in here now and I'm going to simply rewrite this as 3/4 plus 4/5. And I'm going to rewrite this so that I have my new lowest common denominator of 20 in this new problem. Okay, that's equals. So 3/4 equals some number over 20, and 4/5 is going to equal some number over 20. So again, I have to first and foremost figure out what is going to be the number that goes in my numerator. So the first thing I'm going to ask myself here is, okay, 4 times what number, what some number here is going to equal 20? Well, I happen to know that 4 times 5 is 20. So if I take that 5 and I multiply it by the number that's on top in my numerator, 5 times 3 is 15. Okay, so that's my numerator for the first fraction. Now let's go down to the second one. 5 times what number is going to give me 20? Well, I know it's 5 times 4. So I'm going to take the 4 and I'm going to multiply by the number on top, in this case, in my numerator, which is 4. So 4 times 4 is 16. So now this problem becomes a lot simpler because what I'm doing is 15, 20 plus 16, 20, which now becomes 31 over 20. And for the purposes of this example, this is sufficient in terms of our answer. So what you're going to end up with is 31 over 20. Now, this is a great way that you can find the lowest common denominator. If you don't know, again, always write your multiplication tables to the side on some scrap paper, kind of like what I did up here, and you can easily identify the lowest common denominator. Okay, let's do one more. Now, if I look at another problem, in this case, I'm going to turn around and say 3, oops, that's not working. There we go. 3/5 plus 6/2. Well, again, as we've mentioned before, I look at my denominators. They're not the same, so I have to find the lowest common denominator. And again, the easiest way to do this is to write the multiplication tables of 5 and 2. So I'm going to sit here and write 5 times 1 is 5, 5 times 2 is 10. And here's a little trick. I have the number 5 and I have the number 2 here, which gives me 10. So if you think about this, I don't have to go any further. And the reason I don't have to go any further is because if I were to write now my 2 times table, 2 times 1 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 3 is 6, 2 times 4 is 8, and again 2 times 5 is 10. Again, the trick here, and I'm hoping that this has become apparent to you, is that I can take a number, 2 numbers, in this case my 2 denominators, and multiply them. So I multiply 5 times 2 and I get 10. Now I'm also checking my multiplication table just to make sure that there isn't a smaller number that I can choose, but in this case it happens to be 10. So I'm going to now rewrite this problem as follows. And I'm going to write it as 3/5, 3/5 plus 6/2, and I'm going to rewrite, you can ignore that right there. I'm going to rewrite this with my new lowest common denominator of 10. And again, I'm going to ask myself, 2 times what number is going to give me 10? Well, it's 5. So I'm going to take 5 times my number here. In this case I did it backwards because I'm doing the bottom, but it doesn't make a difference. 5 times 6 is 30. And I'm going to do 5 times what number equals 10, which is 2. So 2 times 3 is 6. I can now rewrite this problem as 6 tens plus 30 tens, which becomes 6 plus 30 over 10, which becomes 36 over 10. Now, again, for the purposes of the here and now, this at least gets me to where I need to go, but I can always reduce this down further. Why? Because I know that these numbers are both divisible by 2. Why? Because the 6 and the 0 are even. And because they're even, I know that I can go in and reduce this further. So I'm going to reduce this down as follows. I'm going to divide both sides by 2. And when I do that, I can ultimately end up with the following fraction here below, which will be, first of all, the bottom will be 5, because when I divide 2 into 10, it's 5. And when I divide 2 into 36, this actually becomes 18. So I can reduce this down to my furthest, lowest possible value, which is 18/5. The point I want to make, folks, is that any time you are adding or subtracting fractions and the denominators here and here are not the same, you must find the lowest common denominator, replace it as we just did before, and then continue with the same addition and or subtraction rules as we've been doing so far, so that you can come up with your answer.